Today, we're ranking every ice user in anime, from the unique special snowflakes to the ones who will give you hypothermia just for looking at them the wrong way. And our highest tier here is very literally high because it's all the way up past the sky, beyond the stratosphere, all the way out there in outer space. Because these ice users up there are seriously built different because they operate at the planetary or even the galactic scale. And so our first representative of the cold depths of space tier is none other than Sailor Mercury of the Sailor Scouts. Because any serious power scaler knows that Sailor Moon is just on another level. She could beat Goku, she could beat Saitama, she could beat Superman, and even though Sailor Mercury is arguably the weakest of her team, by the end of the series, the entire Sailor Moon Scouts team are basically operating at a galactic scale. And even though Sailor Mercury doesn't have a ton of ice feats and is more known for her water attacks, the sheer scale that she operates on puts her at an advantage and places her in this god level tier. And yeah, call it unfair, but anyone on a lower level tier is gonna have a real tough time dealing with Sailor Mercury. And along with Sailor Mercury in the cold depths of space tier is Princess Snow Kaguya. No, not the chakra alien from Naruto here. This is Princess Snow Kaguya from Sailor Moon S, the movie Hearts in Ice. Because this villain travels the galaxy on a comet, freezing entire planets and adding them to their collection. And just like Sailor Mercury, her powers are on a planetary scale, dwarfing the powers of many of those in the next tier who can only freeze entire, like, you know, countries, regions, etc. Kind of pathetic, really, I know. I mean, is there anyone who can possibly top these two Sailor Moon powerhouses? Who in the universe would possibly be colder than this? Well, as it turns out, a few people, but for now, let's talk about these ice users who are restricted to only the measly planets. And so below the cold depths of space, we find our next tier, the absolute zero tier, because these combatants are as cold as can be. Literally. In science, in case you don't know, absolute zero is the bottom limit of a temperature system measured at 0 Kelvin or minus 273.15 degrees Celsius. Because at that temperature, atoms completely stop moving and there is no energy left in any system. Even outer space has a background radiation that elevates it above this basic temperature, and it's technically impossible to achieve, but manga isn't limited by our silly levels of physics here. And so some characters in this tier literally achieve absolute zero, but others are just capable of transforming entire ecosystems with their powers. And for our first representative of this tier, it's Gray Fullbuster of Fairy Tail, rival to the Fiery Natsu. Because with his ice make magic, Gray can basically create just about anything out of ice, such as weapons and tools. However, his true power comes out when he uses his Ice Devil Slayer magic. Now, this technique, especially effective against demons, allows him greater mastery over ice. In other words, by consuming ice, he boosts his own powers, becoming immune to its effects, and allows him to freeze basically anything within a quite large area with a simple gesture. And joining Gray in this tier, also from Fairy Tail, is Inval Yura, the Winter General. Now, during Inval's fight against Gray, he basically created a blizzard that caused snowfall across a huge region, with characters still miles away from the actual battle remarking on the snow. And even though someone like Gray here is almost completely resistant to cold, Inval's powers were still almost too much for him to resist. In fact, Inval is even able to freeze intangible concepts like willpower using his Ice Slave and Ice Lock techniques, and he can even create an icy collar that suppresses the free will of those caught in the attack. However, his ultimate attack, the True Ice Kamui, creates a suit of ice armor that freezes anything, literally anything that it touches, even other types of ice. However, in the end, Gray edges Inval out because he was also able to conjure an Ice Fist with these properties in the end as well to take out his fellow ice user. However, these characters from Fairy Tail are just the beginning when it comes to the absolute zero tier, so what other characters do we have in store that have even stronger mastery over the cold? But first, after the absolute zero tier, we have the Glacier Tier. Now, people in this tier are not quite as powerful as the previous ones, but are still quite capable of generating devastating attacks that affect large areas. However, in this case, instead of freezing entire ecosystems, they might just be able to freeze something closer to a city block in size roughly. However, unlike some of the fighters we just named above, they might even be susceptible to ice instead of being completely immune to it, much like our first entry here. We're talking about Shoto Todoroki, and as one of Deku's rivals in Class 1A of My Hero Academia, Todoroki has two powerful quirks. That's because he has mastery over both ice and fire. However, it's very important to note here that for this ice power tier list, we're exclusively going to focus on their mastery of ice, so other powers like weapons and abilities just don't count. And unfortunately for Shoto for this tier list, the fact that he can't use his fire abilities really does hurt him here. You see, Todoroki's powers are a result of his father, Endeavor, finding the ideal mate for him to father a child with the perfect combination of quirks. And in the universe of My Hero Academia, many characters with powers aren't actually granted immunity from their own abilities. And therefore, as a result, using his ice powers drastically cools Shoto's own body temperature down, while using his fire powers is overheating them. Now, of course, by using both of these powers in conjunction together, he can strike a quite perfect temperature balance, but since he can only use his ice abilities for this tier list, he'll just basically freeze himself if another competitor doesn't do it first. Of course, he can actually generate insane amounts of ice, but this drawback just sets him solidly in this Glacier tier right here. However, after the Glacier tier, we go to the next level, which is the generic ice user tier. And these fighters do have ice powers, but they're definitely not on any level of the tiers above here. Would they be able to use their powers to defeat at least a regular person? Absolutely, but even within their own universes, they're still pretty average characters and definitely fall flat when compared against characters from other series. Not too strong, not too weak, these fighters are just alright. Starting with Haku. Now, for every Naruto fan running to their keyboard right now, I'm gonna need you to take the nostalgia glasses off a little bit, because a lot of us have really fond memories of watching the Land of Waves arc as kids and thinking that the series' first big baddies, Haku and Zabuza, were really rad. And in fact, Haku's unique Kekkei Genkai ice release really makes him the only notable ice user in the entire series. But still, looking at things objectively, a couple of decades later, his ice is really nothing to write home about. Yeah, he can create ice spikes and projectiles to attack enemies, and his signature technique is to create ice mirrors, and it's all pretty standard stuff and definitely not on par with some of the upper tier level characters that we have on this list. And ironically enough, what makes Haku a true threat isn't even his ice release, but combining it with his crazy speed and other ninja techniques, such as using the reflections of his ice mirrors to trick his opponents. All the other tricks that he has up his ninja sleeves aren't going to get him very far on the list here. But to be fair, Haku's ice release jutsu does put him well past everyone in our very bottom tier, which we're very fittingly gonna name the Bring Just a Light Jacket tier. And our first representative for the Bring Just a Light Jacket tier is Yukina from Yu Yu Hakusho. Now, Yukina is a type of demon called an ice apparition, and she's the younger sister of Hiei and the object of Kawabara's affections. Now, Yukina does have mastery over ice, but she's so kind-hearted and would never even use her abilities to harm someone unless her life was in immediate danger. In fact, if anything, Yukina's ice powers actually cause her more harm than good, because when an ice apparition cries, their tears harden into crystal beads that are highly valuable among demons. And so most ice apparitions are so cold-hearted that they only shed one tear in an entire lifetime, but the highly sensitive Yukina cries literally all the time. Now, this of course makes her a prime target for kidnapping by sinister demons who want to profit from her tears, making it so that Yusuke and the gang have to rescue her during the series a couple of times. As a result, she's not all that dangerous, but we do advise you to wear at least a light jacket when encountering Yukina. And before moving back up the list and staying in the same tier and in the same series for a moment, Yu Yu Hakusho has another character that urges us to bring just a light jacket. And that's Seiryu of the Saint Beasts. Now, the Saint Beasts were the first significant group of big bad guys that Team Urameshi had to fight against, and Seiryu, or the Blue Dragon, had command of ice abilities. And his signature attack was the Ice Dragon, where he basically throws several freezing cold punches that fire projectiles that freeze anything that they will come in contact with. However, this is literally the only ice-based technique that we ever see Seiryu use, because Hiei makes really short work of him. Now, Hie's status as a fire demon does make him resistant to ice-based attacks, but he was still left utterly unaffected by Seiryu's attack before slicing him into pieces, leaving the demon to shatter like ice. Now, right now, I would still be placing Seiryu above Yukina, but realistically, Yukina would probably still be above him if she ever actually decided to use her powers in combat. And actually, while we're still on the topic of Yu Yu Hakusho, let's go ahead and take care of the final ice entry on the list here, Toya from the Dark Tournament Saga, who climbs a whole 1 tier into the generic ice users. Because this ice demon shows much more versatility with his abilities by using a whole 3 techniques instead of 1. He didn't have a lot of competition in the series, but he can use ice projectiles, create an ice sword, or use his frozen hell technique to create an ice barrier that freezes his surroundings. Now, of course, if we're talking about ice characters, there is one series that we absolutely can't avoid talking about, one where the coolest characters are, well, the coolest literally as well, and we're of course talking about Bleach. And we're gonna kick things off with Rukia Kuchiki, the Shinigami who very first introduced Ichigo to the Soul Society and who has incredible ice powers. Now, in case you don't know, in Bleach, a Shinigami's power is held within their Zanpakuto, their sword that can release abilities that are unique to each wielder. Rukia Zanpakuto gives her access to multiple ice-based techniques, such as drawing a circle and freezing anything within it, releasing blasts of cold air, and extending her sword with an ice blade. However, as is the case for any Bleach character, Rukia's most devastating power comes from her Bankai, the second release of a Zanpakuto, which results in a much stronger form of the Shinigami's power. And Rukia's Bankai, known as the White Haze Punishment, changes her entire body and outfit into an all-white appearance as she reduces her body's temperature to absolute 0, as a result completely freezing anyone in contact with her along with anyone in her vicinity. And so it's really unfortunate that despite her ability literally being able to reach absolute 0, she's not gonna be in the absolute 0 tier and instead in the Glacier tier. That's because her ability has some dangerous downsides for her, because while she can reach absolute 0, she will die if she maintains that ability for more than 4 seconds. On top of that, she also must release her ability very slowly, or else she could kill or injure herself. And so, since her Bankai is so difficult to master and can even harm herself, that does knock her down into the Glacier tier. However, another Bleach character can top her spot here easily. And we're talking, of course, about Captain Toshiro Hitsugaya, who has the strongest ice-type Zanpakuto in all of Bleach, Hyorinmaru. Now, even though he's still very young by Shinigami standards, having the appearance of a child, Hitsugaya has achieved the rank of captain already. And Hitsugaya's Zanpakuto is a lot more versatile than Rukia's, giving him access to many more techniques and strategies to actually use with his ice powers. For example, when activating his Shikai, which is the first level of his Zanpakuto, the sword unleashes ice dragons which chase down opponents, freezing anything that they touch. In fact, the power of his ice disrupts the atmosphere in the immediate environment, which can create a literal blizzard. On top of that, Hitsugaya's powers also give him complete control over the water in the entire area, including moisture within the air itself, though he can also generate ice even without water being present at all. However, as you probably guessed, this Shinigami's real power only starts coming through though in his Bankai. Because when this captain's Bankai is activated, the ice dragon forms a sort of armor around him. The dragon's mouth encompasses his sword arm, while he wears large icy wings and a tail on his back. Now, this transformation for one hugely increases his freezing powers and all of his other ice-based abilities. On top of that, it also adds new techniques such as being able to create an ice clone in his exact likeness to fool opponents and to summon snow that blooms deadly ice flowers on his opponents as well. Then, while his Bankai is active, 3 flowers of ice form behind Hitsugaya and the paddles slowly melt away one by one. Now, for a long time, it was actually speculated that when all the paddles run out, he would no longer be able to use his Bankai. However, instead, during the 1000-year Blood War arc, it was actually revealed that when the paddles run out, his Bankai actually reaches completion. Because he still has the body of a child, he doesn't have enough power to actually control his full strength. So he's actually able to temporarily age himself up into an adult's body to use the completed form. And in this form, with only 4 seconds of building up his powers, he was able to flash freeze the giant Quincy Jared Valkyrie. So this Shinigami is small but very mighty indeed, and for this he earns his spot as the current top of the absolute 0 tier. But if Hitsugaya comes this early in this video, then who else could possibly show up later to top this Shinigami? But for now, let's move down back from the absolute 0 tier, and instead of quality, we're just gonna talk about quantity for a second and bring up the series with the most representation on this list, with a whole 5 characters. I mean, yeah, ice just isn't really as popular as something like fire when it comes to powers, which means having 5 characters with ice powers in a show practically makes you the fire force of ice, the frost force, if you will. And that distinction actually goes to Black Clover. But wait, Manu, I hear you now asking, what character on Black Clover actually has ice powers? I can think of a wind guy, lots of fire guys, a water guy, no magic at all guy. I wouldn't blame you at all for forgetting, but the ice representatives are in the, well, bring a light jacketeer here. You have Heath Grace, the ice mage who was the first villain that Asta ever had to fight as a Black Bull, and Mariella, a mage from the Diamond Kingdom who played a prominent role in Black Clover's Witch's Forest arc. Then a little bit above them in the generic ice user tier are 𝗘𝗩𝗘𝗥𝗬, the vice captain of the Purple Orca Squad, who you may remember as the guy who got wrecked by Zora's Idealis counter magic. And finally, we have a very recent character, Jinojamori Fuyu, a snow mage who lives in the Black Clover equivalent of Japan, when the author essentially decided to pull a Wano country situation in Black Clover. So yeah, we're 4 characters in, and none of these ice users are particularly strong. And even though admittedly some of Black Clover's powers get absolutely insane, they are not showing a lot of love for ice mages. However, there is one other character here that is special enough that they actually earn a whole new tier of their own. And that's because Lilith is a high-level devil from the Spade Kingdom arc with the power of ice magic, which brings us to the It's Cold as Hell tier. And that's because these characters don't get their ice powers from regular cold, their powers come right from the frigid depths of hell. Just like the other devils in Black Clover, her powers are absolutely broken, and if it weren't for Asta's equally broken powers as well, every wizard in the land would have been in real trouble. That's because Lilith doesn't just freeze her opponents, she can freeze concepts like light and shadow, and whereas some people on our list can be harmed by their own ice powers, well, Lilith can completely turn into ice herself and freely travel through the ice that she generates. And actually, you know, while we are in hell though, we might as well get comfortable because Lilith isn't the only character down here. There's also Blue Exorcist demon General Frost. And of course, everyone's favorite cold as hell character is One Piece's Soul King Brook. Brook, who is the Straw Hats crew's singing skeleton, possesses the powers of the Revive fruit, which allowed him to die exactly once. And then after his first death, his spirit was able to re-inhabit his then decomposed corpse, making him permanently a walking, talking, violin-playing skeleton. Now, Brook actually has a whole host of abilities, such as swordsmanship and being able to let his soul freely leave his body and travel around, but we're here to talk about ice. And coincidentally, by conjuring power directly from the cold depths of hell, he can actually use ice elemental attacks as well. For example, he can use his Chill of the Underworld to coat his sword in a frigid aura that can freeze his opponents and surroundings alike. And now, just a minute ago though, before we took the icy way to hell, we mentioned the literal hottest anime series around, Fire Force, which honestly made up about half the roster of the Fire user video. However, the series has one singular ice user that stands all on their own in a world consumed by flame, 𝗘𝗩𝗘𝗥𝗬. Now, don't let this priest rocking Beats by Dre fool you, because technically his power is actually fire-based, just like everyone else in the series, but through the power of science, he has earned himself a spot in the generic ice user tier as well. And that's because using a process called thermoacoustic refrigeration, he actually traps heat within a musical instrument that kind of looks like a cross between a trombone and a tuba. And then by moving through the loops in the instrument, the energy cools down and actually creates ice. Now, how exactly that actually is supposed to work is kind of a little bit beyond my scientific understanding, but Flam compares it to the same basic principle that makes air conditioning work as well. Well, only that this air conditioning trombone here can actually freeze fiery beasts called infernals, as well as giant flaming tornadoes, I guess. And 𝗘𝗩𝗘𝗥𝗬 actually isn't the only scientist on our list as well. For example, there's also the freezing alchemist Isaac McDougall, the anime-only character from the first episode of Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. Now, this alchemist uses transmutation circles engraved on his gauntlet and tattooed on his hand to affect water, being able to use techniques like boiling or freezing the water inside people's bodies to, well, yeah, basically instantly kill them. As his title does suggest though, he typically uses ice in combat. Funnily enough though, he's basically the least canon part of the more canon anime adaptation of Full Metal Alchemist, and he uses his ice-based alchemy well enough to get a spot in the Glacier Tier. And I was honestly really torn on where to place this character, because while fighting the state alchemists, he's closer to generic ice user tier. However, with considerable prep time, setting up several transmutation circles around Central City, and by using the power of a Philosopher's Stone, he's able to perform truly massive feats. And honestly, if he could do all of that without a performance enhancing stone, he would definitely be in the absolute zero tier, but for now, let's have him be here in the Glacier tier, which I think is fair enough. And joining him in the Glacier tier are actually a couple more characters from Fairy Tail. Leon Vastia, Gray's rival, also uses ice make magic, but typically constructs animals instead of weapons like Gray does. Gotta love it when the cat poops during recording. Their teacher, Or, is also on the same level, having taught both of them how to use this ice make magic. Unfortunately for them, Gray's Ice Devil Slayer magic just takes him to a completely other class of ice user. And joining both of these in the Glacier tier is also 𝗘𝗩𝗘𝗥𝗬 from another series that we've already mentioned on this list, which is My Hero Academia. Now, he's actually one of the lieutenants of the Paranormal Liberation Front, and actually a Oh, no. Yes. Now, he's actually one of the lieutenants of the Paranormal Liberation Front, and actually a distant relative of Shoto Todoroki. And he's actually a distant relative of Shoto Todoroki, explaining his ice plan. And he's actually a distant relative of Shoto Todoroki, explaining his ice play abilities as well. Now, this Iceman robot master ripoff has a massive range for his quirk, which allows him to freeze water and then manipulate ice, and he can do so across basically the range of an entire town. Now, if he's so great, in fact probably better at ice than his cousin Todoroki, why isn't he in the absolute zero tier then? Well, just like Shoto, he can be harmed by his own powers, explaining why he actually needs to bundle up in a thick parka whenever he uses his abilities. In addition to that, he can freely generate ice, but is limited by whatever water or ice is actually available in his direct vicinity. In other words, get 𝗘𝗩𝗘𝗥𝗬 in a desert and he's not going to be effective whatsoever, unlike some other fighters on our list still coming up. And since 𝗘𝗩𝗘𝗥𝗬 did in fact remember to bring his jacket, let's quickly take a trip back to the Bring a Light jacket tier and go over a quick grab bag of some of the more obscure members of our tier list here. For example, from the series Darker Than Black, we have the MI6 agent codenamed November 11, whose cryokinesis allows him to freeze water to create projectiles, make shields, and freeze his victim's blood as well. Stefan Starface from Blood Blockade Battlefront is another really cool guy in a suit who doesn't freeze other people's blood. He actually lowers the temperature of his own blood in order to freeze other people or create ice blades and ice projectiles. Shiba Miyuki from the Regular and Magical High School could probably take on a lot of people from higher tiers, but is really more of a general purpose mage who can use all kinds of magic abilities. In fact, her specialty is speed magic, and in this series, freezing magic is just a subset of that speed magic. She actually does have some ice feats that span huge ranges, but can only achieve those with a casting assistant device, which holds her back from higher tier levels, just like Isaac McDouglas' Philosopher's Stone did for him. Mizori Shirayuki, which translated is literally snow, rain, white snow from Rosario plus Vampire, can use basic ice attacks and create ice puppets that serve as duplicates. And so that we can finally get back to stronger characters, the final member of the Bring a Light Jacket tier is Snow from the mid-2000s isekai Mar. And in the series, character use ARMS, not to be confused with the stretchy Nintendo game. And these ARMS are magical relics that grant their users access to magical abilities. And in Princess Snow's case, that is ice. In particular, she makes use of a guardian snowman that can multiply and reform itself as he protects its user. And so it's no big surprise that a much more impressive isekai ice user is Emilia, one of the lead characters of Re:Zero. As a half-elf who is a candidate for the throne of the country, Emilia has huge reservoirs of mana. She can use several types of magic, but her specialty is ice magic. Using her ice brand arts, she can create weapons from ice as well as command ice soldiers that are more durable than actual metal. And much more importantly, Emilia does actually have some truly incredible feats, such as flash freezing an entire forest, but that was as a child and more of an accidental unleashing of her powers. She sadly doesn't have the capacity to use a technique like that on command. She also has her ultimate last-ditch move, which is Absolute Zero, which once again ironically does not quite earn her a spot in the Absolute Zero tier, which freezes anything within a small vacuum, including time. Unfortunately though, this also includes herself. Despite those quite impressive feats though, she still remains barely in the generic ice user tier because one of the main keys of Emilia's power depends on her use of the spiritual arts. And moreover, she does also need the help of our next character, Puck. Puck here is a spirit who has contracted with Emilia to share his power. However, in reality, Puck is actually known as the Beast of the End. Now, normally he looks quite cute and cuddly, but his true form is that of a giant monster. In fact, when he does take this final true form, the entire region he's in instantaneously erupts in a blizzard and freezes at absolute zero temperatures. Now, funnily enough, in reality, Puck is actually a fire spirit. In order to keep his own heat up, he basically draws heat from his surroundings, generating cold. And so maintaining his Beast of the End form requires huge amounts of mana, which he forcibly draws in from his surroundings. And as a result, if left alone, he would freeze the entire planet. And you know what freezing an entire planet means. That's right, he's our next member finally of the Cold Depths of Space tier. Well, it's been a while since we had one of those. And you know who else is a monster with ice powers? Literally every ice type Pokemon. So here they are in the extra special every ice type Pokemon tier. And there's obviously no signature iconic ice type Pokemon like how Charizard represents all of fire, so we're just gonna let you pick your favorite here. Whether it's the Lapras that Ash wrote in the very first opening, the Articuno that he met on his adventures, Glaceon if you love evolutions, who doesn't, Vanillix if you're really hungry, or you know, Jinx if you made some really questionable decisions in your life. In other words, this entire tier is for your favorite ice-type Pokemon. Now, the next member of our tier list is also pretty beastly. From One Piece, we do have Kaido's kid, Yamato, whose mythical devil fruit transformation turns them into a divine wolf called the Okuchi no Makami, the guardian deity of the country of Wano. As it happens, this actually gives Yamato several ice-based abilities, such as generating an ice barrier or releasing powerful freezing blasts from her mouth. However, most of Yamato's powers don't actually just come from being icy. She also has enough physical strength to go toe-to-toe with her father, who's an absolute literal monster. And so if we only look at her ice powers, this mythical fruit only earns her a place in the generic ice user tier. And another generic ice user with animalistic features is Tooran, a panther demon from Inuyasha, who you will definitely remember if you are of a very specific age and demographic that still remembers watching Inuyasha on late night TV as a child. In case you don't, the 4 panther divas each represent a season, and Tooran's is of course summer. I'm just kidding, it's winter. It's winter. And when walking on a river, it will instantly freeze to create a path for her. She also freezes opponents with frigid winds and wields an ice spear against her opponents as well. Then another demonic presence on our list is 𝗘𝗩𝗘𝗥𝗬 from Rave Master, who freezes her way into the Glacier Tier. And wow, I mean, Hiro Mashima really likes ice powers apparently, given that he wrote this and Fairy Tail, which had a ton of spots on this tier list already. 𝗘𝗩𝗘𝗥𝗬 is one of the 4 demon kings and one of the most powerful inhabitants in the demon world. She's capable of freezing an entire town at will along with all of its citizens, and she also has a power that's pretty unique among her peers on this list. Because after spending countless time exposed to the cold, her literal skeleton itself has become ice, which allows her to recover from any external damage. In other words, it's only by causing internal damage and literally melting her skeleton itself that the heroes of Rave Master were finally able to defeat her. And funnily enough, another demon representative of the Glacier Tier comes to us from Demon Slayer with 𝗏𝗏, the upper rank 2 demon in Muzan's force. And honestly, it's kind of weird that all of these demons are not in the cold depths of Hell Tier. Well, funnily enough, these guys don't get their powers from like literal hell. Like in Demon Slayers, the demons are really more like vampires in a way. So I'm just gonna say that this is fine and my tier list is perfect and in no way logically inconsistent, you know? Now, going back to 𝗏𝗏's blood demon art, it basically gives him access to cryokinesis, allowing him to generate and manipulate any form of ice. The gusts of freezing cold air that he uses to blast at his opponents are cold enough to freeze people's eyeballs or kill the cells in their lungs, rendering them unable to breathe, which, you know, is a pretty bad scenario for the Demon Slayer core, whose techniques all literally rely on breathing. 𝗏𝗏 can also create miniature clones of himself out of ice that are capable of reproducing his techniques, which, judging by the list so far, I never realized how many ice users actually can use clones, interestingly. I mean, yeah, it's not a ton, but it's also way more than you would probably expect from something made out of ice. But moving on, our next Glacier Tier character isn't a demon herself, she just works for one. Well, not a demon exactly, but if anyone is demonic, it's the king of curses, Sukuna from Jujutsu Kaisen. And Sukuna's #1 servant and personal chef, 𝗘𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, has been his faithful servant for over a millennium. And as it happens, their innate curse technique is actually ice, which they can actually create startlingly huge amounts of. And honestly, in a power system where the majority of the powers are quite complex and esoteric and really complicated to understand, it's a very cold breath of fresh air to see a simple elemental ability with 𝗘𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 just conjuring a whole lot of ice to take out their opponents. It's actually also entirely possible that this character can also put their body in a form of cryostasis, a fan theory which would explain why 𝗘𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 has actually seemingly been alive for approximately 1,000 years while waiting for Sukuna to return. However, our next ice user here actually killed Sukuna. Yeah. You heard me right, and I was actually also really shocked when I was researching this because Evangeline McDowell, a vampire from the series Negima, actually does kill a character called Ryomen Sukuna, which, you know, makes sense because JJK Sukuna was actually based on an actual historical figure in Japan, so it's only natural that the name could pop up somewhere else, but, you know, it was still a little bit of a surprise to me. I love that. And as you'd expect from someone who can kill Sukuna, Evangeline McDowell has actually properly earned her way into the absolute 0 tier with a technique literally called the end of the world. Excuse me, how badass is that? In which she literally makes mockery of the laws of thermodynamics. And this technique actually killed Negima's version of Ryomen Sukuna by lowering a 150 square foot area to absolute 0 temperatures. And whereas other absolute 0 users that we've covered so far either do so accidentally or hurt themselves really badly in the process, Evangeline can do so with full control over the ability and, more importantly, without causing any harm to herself. So welcome, very much deserved, to the absolute 0 tier. However, even with this immensely powerful technique, there are still even stronger ice users yet to come. But before we cover the rest of the top tier levels, let's knock out a few more generic ice users before we get there. And first up is Shaman King's 𝗘𝗩𝗘𝗥𝗬, who mostly fights with your typical ice projectiles. He does ride around on a hand-carved snowboard though, and that is honestly pretty cool. Next, 7 Deadly Sins Jericho is a holy knight who follows Ban and who has the ability to manipulate ice and lower the temperature around her. Yukihina, an antagonist from Codebreaker, uses ice as a subset of his forms of water power, but who can also turn ice suddenly into vapor to create an actual explosion. So basically not necessarily an ice power purely, but points for creativity, and Dr. Stone would be truly proud here, I think. Which brings us to our final generic ice user, who is Katara from Avatar: The Last Airbender, which, come on, is totally an anime. I mean, come on. Also, her ice powers are the only thing about her that's actually generic, because she's an all-around fantastic character. Her waterbending, as the name would suggest, is mostly water-based, but she does use some ice techniques as well. Now, if this was a blood-bending tier list, she might score a lot higher, but her ice ability are anything but that, I guess. And you know, in case you're mad that I considered Katara an anime character for this list, then hold off on submitting that comment quite yet, because you're gonna want to add to that message after this next one. Because climbing all the way back up to the absolute 0 tier is an absolutely anime character, Elsa from Frozen. And I know what you're saying now. Frozen is made by Disney, American productions don't count as anime. Well, have you considered that Frozen was actually based on The Snow Queen by Hans Christian Andersen, who is Danish, thus making Frozen technically anime? Well, in case you don't know, in Frozen, Elsa basically plunges the entire kingdom of Arendelle into everlasting winter. And if that wasn't impressive enough for you, she also breathed literal sentient life into a snowman. And this isn't a tricky ice clone. Her ice powers are so powerful they can literally create a whole living being, including a soul. And if all of that doesn't earn Elsa a top spot on this list, I really don't know what else can. But okay. Enough Disney for today. You know, I had my gag. Back to the real anime. Because back at the Glacier tier, we have Judar from Magi. And while once again not exclusively an ice mage, Judar is still an ice specialist. For example, his rain of ice spears creates a giant shard. It then splits into a multitude of smaller shards that he individually can direct, and when they strike, they freeze the area where they land immediately. Combine this with his ability to conjure ice tornadoes that follow his opponents, and you've got yourself a quite dangerous and powerful ice user. And lastly, in the Glacier tier is yet another character from One Piece, Monet, the bird woman and lab assistant who ate the snow fruit. And I'm not biased, I swear, the One Piece ice users are just really good. And I'm sure to already have enough people getting at me in the comment section for putting Monet above Yamato, but let me explain here for a second. For one, Monet's snow fruit is a Logia type power, which basically, for those uninitiated under you, means that the user can generate limitless amounts of their element. Not only that, but they also are their element. Their body is it. So unlike those in lower tiers who might be harmed by their own frigid powers, Monet literally is made out of snow and can turn herself into her element completely to avoid any physical damage from attacks. Unless her opponent uses Haki, of course, that is. Still, Monet is nothing compared to the next character on our list though, Azthoth from Akame ga Kill. Because Azthoth is one of the main antagonists of the series, a powerful general of the Empire whose blasts of ice can take down entire cities and armies alike. She can drop ice crystals the size of meteors at a moment's notice. However, it's her trump cards that are the reason that she makes it all the way into the absolute 0 tier. Because using a relic called a Tegu that only the most powerful warriors can wield, she was able to develop a true mastery over ice. With her ice cavalry, she can create an entire army out of ice soldiers, and with her ice commander-in-chief, she can then draw the power from her cavalry to enhance her own strength, basically allowing herself to engulf an entire continent in winter. And finally, as if those powers weren't somehow broken enough yet, her Mahakadoma then lets her freeze time itself, allowing her to stop any opponent in their tracks, while she then just goes on to chilly defeat them. And so honestly, it's kind of hard to believe that there is one other stronger character on this list than Azthoth, but there is another ice user who just simply dwarfs her power and makes her look like nothing. And that character is none other than Yuri Katsuki from Yuri on Ice, entering in a brand new tier for his insane powers, the Skating is My Passion tier. And so through brutal training and hard work, Yuri was able to achieve impressive powers on the ice, such as the quad salcho and the quad flip. Okay, yeah, it was another joke, but the actual shocking thing, you know, is that there was actually another character I was able to find who was also fitting in the Skating is My Passion tier. Or should I say bizarre? Because, yeah, of course there has to be a JoJo character on this list as well. Because Ghiaccio, whose name is just Italian for ice, because of course it is from Vento Audio, is one of the few stand users to actually wear his stand. White Album appears as a white suit around his body that gives him excellent control over ice. He forms blades on his feet to skate on and chases down Giorno and the gang, all while performing feats like solidifying people to the point that their vitals stop and their limbs can literally scatter. Okay, let's turn off the Avril Lavigne because we're done with the Skater Boys and going back to the real most top tier characters on our list. And so before we return to the top god tier level of this list, we have to finish off the absolute zero tier, where we have One Piece's Kuzan, aka Admiral Aokiji. Once one of the strongest forces within the Marines, Kuzan's Ice Fruit is a Logia type that allows him to freely create and turn into ice. However, he has a much greater mastery over this power than someone like Monet. What I mean by that is that he can freely flash freeze several kilometers of ocean thickly enough that it won't thaw for days at a time. He can trap escaping enemy ships by freezing the very water they're in, and even instantly flash freeze huge tsunami waves. And that's of course only in addition to making insane weapons like swords and spears and pheasants, everyone's favorite weapon I guess. And he can also freeze people right down to their core, but can do so with such precision as not to kill them if he wants to. Of course, as an alternative, he can also just shatter them into a million pieces. But his greatest feat so far though is actually changing the literal climate of an entire island permanently. That's because after his fight with the Admiral Akainu, he left half of the island of Punk Hazard as a frozen wasteland tundra, and it just stayed that way forever on. And so even without reality bending powers like reaching a temperature of absolute zero or freezing time itself, Kuzan still remains one of the greatest ice users in anime for the sheer versatility and mastery of his ice powers. But surprise, even Aokiji isn't the strongest ice user on this list, because for that we have to go back all the way to the cold depths of space tier, where we see Sinus Hyoga, his teacher Aquarius Camus, and his rival Kraken Isaac from Saint Seiya. I know they're not literally in space, they're in Greece, but the characters are all named after constellations, and those are in space, so it kind of works out, you know. Also, the characters in the Saint Seiya universe are dealing with cosmic forces and gods, with their powers operating at a truly galactic or even universal scale, so they might as well be in space for all it matters. For one, Kraken Isaac's Aurora Borealis technique and Aquarius Camus' Aurora Execution both produce effects nearing absolute zero. However, Sinus Hyoga unlocks the ability to surpass his teacher, unleashing an Aurora Execution technique that is several hundred times colder than absolute zero, which, you know, is super physically impossible, but also it is very ridiculously cold. Like, literally cool because of how cold it is, you know? And yeah, I do know that some of the results on this tier list were quite shocking, but they weren't nearly as shocking, I promise you, as the electrifying participants of this other video about ranking every lightning user in anime, so head over there to see if any of the competition is on the same level as any of these ice users. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, subscribe. I know it's very annoying, but it really helps out a channel like this one. Otherwise, I hopefully will see you in the next one.